It was a night of nostalgia and celebration, a time for old friends to reconnect and reminisce about the good old days. The 50th high school reunion was in full swing, filling the grand banquet hall with laughter, chatter, and familiar faces that had aged but still carried traces of their youth. Among the attendees was a married couple who had been together for decades, a pair that everyone admired and envied for the stability and happiness they seemed to represent. The wife, always kind and supportive, had built a life around her husband, feeling proud of their relationship and the journey they had taken together. She never suspected that this evening, meant for memories and smiles, would unravel secrets she could never have anticipated. The husband, usually a quiet but well-liked man, had seemed especially excited about the reunion. The wife, at first, thought it was simply the thrill of reconnecting with his youth and seeing old friends. Yet, as the evening wore on, she couldn't help but notice a slight change in his demeanor. He seemed unusually animated, almost nervous, as he moved through the crowd, exchanging friendly nods and handshakes. Then she saw it, the glance he exchanged with a woman across the room, a look that was far too familiar and lingered a second too long. The woman was beautiful, with a charm that held traces of her younger self. She was his high school sweetheart. As the wife watched them from a distance, a chill ran down her spine. Her husband was smiling in a way she hadn't seen in years, a look reserved for someone who meant something more than just an old friend. For a moment she pushed the thought aside, trying to shake off what she hoped was just a misunderstanding. But as the night continued, her husband's behavior grew stranger, and she found herself unable to ignore the uncomfortable feeling twisting inside her. He was attentive to this woman, leaning in a little too close, laughing a little too loud. Every now and then he would disappear from her side, reappearing moments later with weak excuses. His attempts to downplay his absences only deepened her suspicions. She couldn't resist the urge to dig deeper. When her husband left his phone unattended for a moment, she glanced around, took a quick breath, and unlocked it. What she saw left her heart pounding. Recent text messages between him and his high school flame told a story she was not prepared to see. The words were flirtatious, full of memories and nostalgia, hinting at an ongoing connection. They had exchanged messages in secret, slipping away to relive something that was supposed to have been left in the past. Each message struck her like a blow, shattering the life she thought she knew. With every line, her mind raced through the years they'd spent together, the trust she had given him, and the life they had built. She had been supportive, loyal, standing by him through thick and thin. Yet here he was, rekindling a romance from decades ago, hiding it from her with the kind of thrill and secrecy she never imagined he would seek outside their marriage. Her initial shock quickly turned to anger. The wife's heart raced as she pieced together the truth from those messages, feeling the sting of betrayal with every word she read. She put his phone down carefully, her mind now consumed with questions and disbelief. Was this just a harmless exchange between old friends, or had it become something deeper and more dangerous to her marriage? As she observed him from a distance, her husband seemed carefree, his eyes drifting back to his high school sweetheart with a warmth that felt entirely misplaced. Each glance, each quiet exchange between them only confirmed her suspicions, but she needed more than just suspicion. She needed the truth. The night stretched on, and her husband's excuses continued. He was slipping away from her side more frequently, each time finding another reason to speak to his former flame. She decided to follow him without him noticing, weaving through the crowd as he made his way to a quieter corner of the hall. There, she caught him in conversation with the woman, standing closer than any friend should, his voice low and intimate. She was no longer just a quiet observer. She was a wife witnessing her husband betray their trust in real time. The pain settled deep within her, transforming into something sharper and colder, anger mixed with resolve. At that moment she made up her mind. She could no longer stand by silently, watching him indulge in this affair while everyone else around them saw only a happy couple. She didn't want a private confrontation or quiet words of disappointment. She wanted the world to know what he had done, to feel the weight of the betrayal in front of everyone they both knew. She was not only fighting for her dignity, but for a truth that he had hidden from her. This betrayal deserved to be exposed, and she would do it in the most direct way possible. Her heart still heavy with the hurt, she took a steadying breath and prepared herself for what she knew would be a moment that would change everything. As the reunion banquet continued, the wife carefully rehearsed her words in her mind, feeling a mixture of nervousness and anger growing stronger with each passing minute. She could see her husband still chatting with his high school sweetheart, laughing as if nothing were wrong, as if he hadn't just shattered the trust they had built over a lifetime together. She watched him, feeling the weight of years of loyalty and love pressed against the cold realization of his betrayal. This was a man she had devoted herself to, someone she believed in, yet here he was, unburdened by guilt, savoring the presence of a woman he had once loved and, it seemed, had never truly let go of. The pain was raw, and the betrayal felt like a knife twisting deeper with every glance. But she steadied herself, knowing she needed to hold on to that anger, to let it fuel her resolve. She considered confronting him in private, pulling him aside to demand an explanation, but a quiet confrontation no longer felt like enough. The humiliation he had brought upon her in front of their friends, many of whom had known them for decades, was something she couldn't ignore. This was supposed to be an event to celebrate shared memories and old friendships, but instead he had turned it into a personal betrayal in front of an audience of people who had always viewed them as a strong, unbreakable couple. He had publicly disrespected their marriage, and now she would make sure everyone saw him for who he really was. She felt her heart race as she rose from her seat, taking a few steps toward the front of the room where the microphone stood, ready for anyone who wanted to share a toast or memory. Her palms were sweaty, her voice a little shaky as she gripped the microphone. As she looked out at the crowd, she saw her husband in the distance, his eyes widening slightly as he noticed her standing there, unsure of what she was about to say. She took a deep breath and began, keeping her voice as calm as she could manage, though it wavered with emotion. She spoke about the years they had shared, the life they had built, and the trust they had in each other, setting the stage for a message that at first seemed to echo the sentimental tone of the evening. But then her voice hardened, and she turned to face him directly. She revealed, right there in front of everyone, that her husband had rekindled an affair with his high school sweetheart, a romance he had kept secret from her until that very night. She described his betrayal in painful, deliberate detail, her words painting a picture of a man who had chosen to break the heart of the woman who had stood by his side for decades. Gasps rippled through the crowd, friends and classmates exchanging shocked glances as her words sank in, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from festive to tense and heavy with discomfort. Her husband's face turned pale as he realized that his hidden affair was no longer a secret, and that his facade of loyalty had been shattered. She continued, recounting moments from earlier in the evening, each one highlighting the painful truth she had discovered. She revealed how she had seen him exchange lingering looks, how she had read through the text messages, and how he had vanished into quiet corners with the woman he once claimed to have left in the past. Every word hit like a hammer, not just on her husband, but on everyone who had gathered around them, many of whom looked on in stunned silence. Some were visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats or lowering their eyes, unsure of where to look or how to react. Others whispered to one another, shocked by the unexpected revelation of a scandal within what seemed to be an untouchable marriage. Her husband, no longer able to avoid the attention, stammered, trying to respond, but words failed him. His confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a mixture of shame and anger, though he couldn't muster the courage to deny it outright. Instead, he began to make excuses, trying to downplay what he had done, fumbling through half-hearted apologies, claiming it was nothing serious, just a bit of reminiscing with an old friend. But his weak explanations only deepened the hurt. He was clearly rattled, but the wife could see he still hadn't grasped the full impact of his actions. With her final words, she made it clear to everyone in the room, and especially to him, that this betrayal was not something she would forgive or forget. Her voice grew softer, but her words were as sharp as ever. She told him that while he had chosen to cherish memories from the past with someone else, he had destroyed their future together. As her words settled over the room, the reality of her husband's betrayal hung thick in the air, a silent weight pressing down on everyone present. The whispers among friends and former classmates grew louder, filling the space with a mixture of disbelief, pity, and shock. Some of the older couples exchanged knowing glances, as if they had seen similar secrets before in their own marriages, while others looked at her husband with open disappointment. He stood frozen, unable to move or respond, pinned under the judgmental gaze of friends who had once admired him, and a wife who now saw him for who he truly was. The high school sweetheart, who had been standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. She hadn't expected their hidden romance to be exposed in such a dramatic and public way, and now, with eyes on her as well, she fumbled for an escape. She tried to take a step back, blending into the crowd, but the damage was already done. The wife's words had illuminated every hidden corner of their affair, leaving no room for denial or excuses. There was no longer any way to pretend this was just a fleeting connection or a harmless reunion of old flames. She looked nervously at the husband, hoping he might say something to lessen the tension, but he remained silent, still caught off guard, his mind scrambling for a way to salvage what little was left of his reputation. But there was no way out. The wife's courage had stripped him of every excuse, every possible explanation. The weight of his actions and the consequences he had never considered were now laid bare, visible to all who cared to look. With nothing left to hide behind, he attempted a feeble apology, his voice barely audible. He tried to mumble something about not intending to hurt anyone, that he had simply been caught up in the moment, but his words sounded hollow. The wife could see in his eyes that he was more embarrassed than remorseful, more concerned with the public shame than with the pain he had caused her. His discomfort only intensified the hurt, as she realized that the man she had trusted all these years was not the person she thought he was. Then, the wife turned to the crowd, her voice steadier now, as if the public confession had given her strength. She thanked her friends and former classmates for listening, acknowledging the uncomfortable position her revelation had placed them in. She apologized to them for disrupting the night, but added that she could no longer bear the weight of her husband's lies. She wasn't just a woman scorned, she was someone who deserved respect, someone who had been deeply hurt but was strong enough to speak her truth. Her words resonated with some, who nodded in quiet support, while others simply looked away, unsure of how to react to the rawness of her emotions. With her final words, she announced that she would be leaving him, severing the ties she once thought would last a lifetime. The crowd watched in stunned silence as she walked away, head held high, leaving her husband standing there, visibly shaken and alone. The high school sweetheart quietly slipped away as well, disappearing into the shadows of the room, no longer wanting to be part of the chaos she had helped to create. As the wife exited, a few friends hurried after her, offering words of comfort and support. She had faced her greatest betrayal, and emerged stronger, her dignity intact, while her husband remained in the banquet hall, left to confront the ruins of the life he had so thoughtlessly dismantled. After the wife's exit, the atmosphere in the banquet hall shifted from shock to an uneasy silence. The attendees looked at each other, processing what they had just witnessed. Conversations picked up in hushed tones, and people began piecing together the glimpses of tension they had noticed earlier in the evening. The wife's watchful eyes, the husband's distracted behavior, and the high school sweetheart's presence, which now seemed far from innocent. This event, meant to celebrate decades of shared memories, had turned into something no one would soon forget. The joyful nostalgia that had filled the evening was replaced by a raw reminder of how fragile relationships could be, even after 50 years. The husband remained rooted in place, his face flushed with embarrassment, his mind racing with the reality of what he had lost. He had not only betrayed his wife, but had also shattered the image of the loyal, dependable husband he had spent years cultivating. He glanced around the room, seeing familiar faces now filled with disappointment and judgment. Some friends turned away, no longer meeting his gaze, while others whispered among themselves, recounting what they had witnessed. The humiliation stung deeper than he had anticipated, as he realized that his actions had not only damaged his marriage, but had also tarnished his standing in the eyes of those who had respected him for so long. As he stood there, his mind drifted back to his high school sweetheart, now nowhere to be seen. In that moment, he felt the hollowness of what he had sacrificed. The excitement and secrecy of reconnecting with her had blinded him to the value of the life he'd shared with his wife. The thrill that had once seemed so tempting now felt trivial, especially in contrast to the devastation it had caused. The weight of his actions settled heavily on him as he began to grasp that his choices had cost him more than just a momentary lapse in judgment. They had cost him the love and loyalty of a woman who had stood by him through every chapter of his life. Meanwhile, outside the hall, the wife found herself surrounded by supportive friends. They wrapped their arms around her, offering words of comfort and strength, reassuring her that she had done the right thing. Although her heart still ached, she felt a small sense of relief in the company of people who genuinely cared for her. The public revelation, though painful, had freed her from the hidden weight she had carried all evening. She realized now that her husband's affair had not only broken her heart, but had also shown her the strength she had within herself. She was no longer the woman willing to overlook betrayal in the name of preserving appearances. She was someone who could stand up for herself, even if it meant walking away from the life she had known. With a final glance back at the hall, she resolved to start a new chapter, one where she could rebuild her life without the shadow of deceit. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but surrounded by friends who supported her, she felt the first glimmer of hope. This wasn't the ending she had ever imagined, but it was a beginning she could face with her head held high. She had turned her pain into strength, and as she walked away, she left the banquet hall and her husband's betrayal behind her, ready to embrace a future she would build on her own terms. Inside the banquet hall, conversations shifted into full-blown discussions. Some guests openly expressed their shock, while others speculated about what might have led the husband to rekindle an old flame after so many years. His classmates exchanged glances, questioning the loyalty of a man they once respected, and the whispers grew louder, making it impossible for him to ignore the judgmental eyes surrounding him. He could feel the scrutiny from people who had once been friends, the weight of their disappointment pressing down on him. He realized painfully that his momentary thrill had cost him the respect and admiration he had taken for granted all these years. Left standing alone, the husband tried to salvage what little dignity he had, but every attempt felt hollow. He made his way from group to group, attempting to explain himself, but his words were met with polite nods or quick dismissals. People turned away, unwilling to engage with his weak excuses. With every person who avoided his gaze or simply walked away, the full impact of his actions became clearer. He was no longer just a man who had made a mistake. He was a man who had betrayed a woman who had been his partner, his confidant, his strongest support. The realization that he had isolated himself from not just his wife, but his entire community, weighed heavily on him. Meanwhile, the wife had found solace in her friends, who had gathered around her outside the banquet hall. They listened as she shared her emotions, letting her express the hurt, confusion, and anger that had been building up. Their presence reminded her that she wasn't alone, that she was more than just her husband's wife. She was her own person, someone worthy of love and respect. Though the pain of the betrayal was still fresh, her friend's unwavering support gave her a new sense of strength and clarity. For the first time that night, she felt empowered, no longer bound by the weight of her husband's actions. As she shared her heart with those around her, she realized that this painful experience had given her an opportunity to redefine her life. The betrayal had been a wound, yes, but it had also been a catalyst, a moment of truth that freed her from illusions she had held onto for too long. Surrounded by people who valued her, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't need to remain trapped in the shadows of her husband's choices. She could carve out a new path for herself, one where she embraced her own happiness and independence. Her heartbreak would not define her, her resilience would, and with that, she turned her focus away from the past and toward the future she would now face on her own terms. Inside the hall, the husband was finally beginning to understand the full extent of his loss. The reality of his actions had settled in, and he was left alone in a room full of people, feeling more isolated than he ever had in his life. Every face around him reminded him of the life he had thrown away, of the woman who had once loved him deeply and unconditionally. He knew that his actions could never be undone, that no apology would ever mend the broken trust or heal the wounds he had caused. For years he had taken his wife's presence and loyalty for granted, believing that their bond was unbreakable. But now, as he stood there, he realized he had dismantled it piece by piece, driven by a fleeting sense of nostalgia that now felt hollow. Desperation began to creep in. He wanted to find her, to explain himself, to somehow make her understand, but he knew deep down that his words would be empty. He had broken something far too sacred, and there was no going back. His regret, which had once felt manageable, now overwhelmed him, leaving him with a sense of helplessness. The memories of his marriage, of all the moments they had shared, flashed through his mind, each one now tainted by his actions. His choices had led him to this point, a place where he could no longer look at himself without seeing the damage he had caused. Outside, the wife was feeling the beginnings of peace settle within her. With each passing moment, the rawness of the hurt began to fade, replaced by a sense of resilience. Her friend's words and gestures of support reminded her of her own strength, of the life she still had ahead of her, a life no longer tied to someone who couldn't see her worth. She realized she didn't need to wait for an apology that might never come, nor did she need to forgive him in order to move forward. Her dignity and self-respect were intact, and that was enough. As she stood there, she looked back at the banquet hall, knowing she was leaving behind not only her husband, but also the weight of years of betrayal that she hadn't even realized had been building. She wasn't walking away defeated. She was walking away with the knowledge that she deserved better. This chapter was closing, but the next one was entirely in her control. With her friends by her side, she took her first steps into a new beginning, feeling lighter, stronger, and ready to face whatever came next. As the wife walked away from the banquet hall, she felt a renewed sense of freedom, a clarity she hadn't felt in years. The years she had spent standing by her husband's side, supporting him, and believing in their life together suddenly seemed like a distant memory, a chapter she had outgrown. Now, with every step, she was reclaiming her life, building a path forward that was hers alone. The doubts and insecurities that had surfaced when she first discovered his betrayal began to dissolve, replaced by a calm resolve. She was no longer defined by his choices or mistakes. She was defined by her strength to face the truth and walk away from it. Her friends stayed close, giving her the space to reflect, while reminding her that she was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her. They encouraged her, sharing memories and words of affirmation, reminding her of who she was beyond the role of a devoted wife. As they walked together, she began to laugh, a sound that surprised even her. It was a small laugh, hesitant at first, but it grew into something warm and genuine. In that moment, she knew she was starting to heal. She hadn't planned for this turn in her life, but she realized she had everything she needed to rebuild. She would be fine, even if the journey ahead was uncertain. Inside, the husband remained alone, replaying the events of the evening over and over in his mind. His regret deepened, becoming an ache that he couldn't ignore. He couldn't shake the image of his wife standing tall, speaking her truth in front of everyone, and the resolve in her voice as she declared her independence. He had underestimated her strength, taking her loyalty for granted, never imagining that she would choose herself over the years they'd spent together. Now, he was left with nothing but the empty consequences of his actions. As he walked through the emptying hall, his footsteps echoed in the silence, a stark reminder of the loneliness he had brought upon himself. The laughter and memories he had once shared with his wife felt hollow now, leaving a void that no high school romance could ever fill. His friends had dispersed, the few who had approached him earlier now keeping their distance, unwilling to be associated with the man who had shattered his marriage in such a public and humiliating way. He was left with a crushing sense of finality, a painful awareness that he had lost something irreplaceable, not just his wife, but the respect of those around him. As he left the banquet hall, he realized he was walking into a future shaped entirely by his mistakes, with no one left to share it with. As the wife continued her journey away from the banquet hall, she felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Her friends walked alongside her, talking softly, reminding her of the years of support and laughter they had shared, independent of her husband. For so long, her life had been interwoven with his, her identity molded by the role of a loyal spouse. But now, with each step, she felt a stronger sense of self emerging. She had been forced to face a truth that was painful, but in doing so, she had uncovered her own resilience, her own voice, and her own worth. They arrived at a quiet cafe nearby, a place where she could finally sit down and process everything. She took a deep breath, savoring the calm after the storm, while her friends rallied around her, bringing warmth and comfort. As they talked, she began to share memories of her marriage, the good, the bad, the overlooked signs. The conversation shifted from sorrow to strength, and she realized she had an opportunity to rebuild her life on her terms. She could take the time to rediscover herself, exploring passions and dreams that had long been set aside. The pain was still there, lingering beneath the surface, but she understood that it would diminish in time. What would remain was her newfound strength, her clarity, and the realization that she deserved more than to be an afterthought in someone else's life. Meanwhile, her husband wandered through the empty streets, each step echoing in the night as he struggled to grasp what he had lost. The reality of his actions weighed down on him like a leaden cloak, suffocating and heavy. The memories of his wife's unwavering support, her kindness and her devotion resurfaced, each one a stark reminder of what he had discarded. He had seen her stand by his side through challenges, through the mundane rhythms of life, and he had foolishly thought her love would be constant, no matter what he did. Now, he realized just how deeply he had taken her for granted, mistaking her loyalty for weakness. In that moment, regret overwhelmed him. He wanted to turn back, to somehow undo what he had done, but he knew it was far too late. The love they once shared, the life they had built, lay shattered, and he was left with nothing but the hollow ache of his choices. He found himself wishing he could tell her how much he regretted it, that he could take back the hurt he had caused. But deep down, he knew an apology would be meaningless now. She had walked away, choosing herself and her dignity over a marriage that had betrayed her. And he, for the first time, understood the true price of his betrayal, a life of loneliness filled only with memories of what he had so thoughtlessly lost. As dawn began to break, the wife found herself feeling lighter, as though the first light of a new day mirrored the new beginning she was stepping into. She watched the sun rise with a sense of calm and quiet strength, appreciating the beauty of the moment. It was a reminder that life would go on, and that every day from this point forward was hers to shape. The future was still uncertain, but it was no longer overshadowed by betrayal. She could finally move forward without the doubts and suspicions that had plagued her, leaving the past behind and embracing the possibilities ahead. Surrounded by friends who had supported her through the hardest night of her life, she felt a renewed sense of gratitude. The loyalty and care they showed reinforced her decision. They reminded her of her worth and the kind of love she deserved, the kind that didn't come with conditions or secrets. She thought about the freedom she now had to rebuild her life, to pursue the things that brought her joy, and to rediscover parts of herself she had neglected in the name of maintaining a marriage. The realization gave her a sense of purpose. She was ready to reclaim her identity, separate from her role as a wife, and embrace the journey that lay ahead. At the same time, her husband was still coming to grips with the emptiness he now faced. Alone in his home, he wandered through rooms filled with memories of a life he had once shared with his wife. Everywhere he looked, there were reminders of her presence, photographs from family vacations, small tokens of their shared experiences, and traces of her warmth that still lingered. He was haunted by the echoes of what they had once had, a life now irrevocably changed by his choices. Regret gnawed at him, sharper with each passing moment, as he replayed the events of the reunion in his mind, realizing the finality of what he had done. As he sat in silence, the depth of his isolation began to settle in. He understood now that his wife's departure wasn't just a temporary reaction to a mistake. It was a definitive choice, one she had made with conviction. She had reclaimed her life, choosing self-respect and integrity over a partnership that had failed her. And while he wished he could take back his actions to somehow reverse the pain he had caused, he knew it was too late. She had moved on, leaving him with the irreversible consequences of his betrayal, a life filled with regrets and the loss of the one person who had truly loved him. As the days passed, the wife found herself settling into a new routine, one centered around her own needs, interests, and well-being. She reconnected with old hobbies, activities she had once loved, but had put aside to focus on her marriage. She found joy in small things, reading a book undisturbed, taking long walks, and meeting friends without the lingering shadow of distrust or anxiety. With each day, her confidence grew, and she discovered a renewed sense of self that had long been overshadowed by the compromises of marriage. Her spirit felt lighter, her outlook clearer, and she began to truly embrace this fresh start, feeling a peace that came from reclaiming her independence. Her friends continued to stand by her, offering their companionship and encouragement. They saw the transformation in her, the strength, the resilience, the spark that had returned to her eyes. In their conversations they laughed, shared stories, and reminded her of the woman she had always been, a woman who was compassionate and strong, someone who could face even the toughest challenges with grace. As she reflected on her journey, she felt a deep gratitude for these friendships that had grounded her through the storm. She knew that she had emerged from this painful chapter not as a broken heart, but as a stronger, wiser person, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. For her husband, however, life had taken a much darker turn. Each day felt heavier than the last, as he struggled to come to terms with the emptiness his actions had created. The house, once filled with warmth and companionship, now felt cold and lifeless. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of the laughter, conversations, and shared routines that had defined their life together. He spent his days haunted by the memories of their marriage, recalling moments of kindness and love that he had taken for granted, moments that now felt painfully distant and unreachable. In his solitude, he began to understand the true depth of his mistake. The fleeting excitement he had sought from his high school sweetheart paled in comparison to the life he had lost, the trust he had destroyed, and the love he had so carelessly cast aside. Every attempt to distract himself only brought him back to the reality of his own choices, a reality filled with regret and an acute awareness of his loneliness. He realized that he had lost more than just his wife. He had lost the life they had built, the future they had once envisioned, and the respect of those around him. His world, once secure and familiar, was now fractured beyond repair, leaving him with nothing but the haunting reminder of what could have been